Today we're going to talk about technique, which is a fundamental part of any strength training program. If you want to be good, if you want to take this thing as far as you can, you have to concern yourself with technique, all the way down to, what to do with dumbbells and machines if you're trying to target a particular muscle, up to big compound movements, your competitive lifts. How are you going to get the most out of your build with your squat, your bench, your deadlift, or anything else you might compete in? So we're going to break down technique. There's been a bit of controversy for God knows what reason. The internet. People are crazy. Always with the controversy. So we're going to get into kind of a principled breakdown of all of these elements, how they're important. So hopefully we can identify what the important factors are going to be for you regarding technique. So the big question, does good even exist? Is there such a thing as good technique? Well, when we say technique, we're talking about body positioning, movement path, and any cue that you might use that helps you get more out of the lift. So that might be squeezing a little bit harder on a set of dumbbell presses, or it might be cranking your feet into the ground when you're trying to get your glutes tight in a squat. So anything that has to do with how you're positioned, where the bar is going, and what specifically you're doing to augment the lift for whatever purpose you're using it for. Stance, grip, bar placement, those are the big ones. That's you setting yourself up around the barbell or around the implement. Bar path is a big one. Is the bar going to go in a straight line? Are you going to arc it? Where are your knees, hips, and elbows going? You can tuck your elbows on a bench, you could flare them out, and there's a whole host of reasons as to why you might do that. And then, like I said, the internal cues. I mean, what you're doing to feel a particular muscle. Bracing is probably the biggest one I can think of, as well as packing in your lats or doing all this weird shit with your upper back when you're trying to get tight for a press or for a deadlift. So all of those count as technique. These characteristics, they should be deliberate, and they very often will be, but they can also be unintentional, and that might be a blind spot for you. All the things you're either not doing that you're not aware of, or that you subconsciously are doing, or that just kind of show up as part of you not paying attention, that all count as your technique. So it's not just the things you're fixating on, it's everything together. So it's in your best interest to pay attention, and they're going to vary just wildly among different lifters. I mean, based on your build, based on everything from tendon insertion to genetics to where you feel comfortable. I mean, all of these things are going to impact where your technique is going to be best suited. Why do we concern ourselves with it? What is it for? I mean, what decisions are we trying to make when we're considering technique? Well, there's three big ones. You can tweak technique for developmental purposes, for performance, or for injury prevention. Those are the big ones. Developmental purposes is what most of your training should concern itself with. Yes, you do need specificity and skill acquisition with your performance-based setup, but the developmental considerations are actually what grow you. If there wasn't some developmental carryover from your performance setup, then everybody would look like a 135-pound world champion. Everybody would be thin and emaciated, and they'd be just trying to get the most out of their movement setup. But the fact is, all of these movements will grow you to some capacity. So they all have some developmental benefit. Now, most people, when they're thinking about technique with their lifts, they're actually thinking about performance. They're thinking, how do I set up to just squeeze the most out of this exercise? Because I got into lifting as somebody who weighs 160 pounds. So obviously I need to stay that way. That's my competitive class. So to get stronger without gaining an ounce of muscle, I just need to technique my way, wedge my way into this elite lift. Now, there's a little bit of truth to that. We're always trying to get more efficiency. We're always trying to get the most out of the competitive setup that we can, given our current abilities. Obviously, you want to try to develop your potential for those abilities. And part of that is, yes, developing yourself, getting bigger and stronger. But yes, we do want to concern ourselves with things like efficiency. Like, how are you going to play best into your leverages? Those long ass lanky legs you have that might make you a really good cross country runner. Well, unfortunately, you chose squatting as a pastime. So you have to figure out how to make those things work for you. And then injury prevention. Bit of controversy around this. The list of things you have to pay attention to minimize your risk are pretty basic, and they're pretty self-evident to everybody. A lot of people, when they're starting off by themselves, might not really know. They might not be quite as aware of some of the bigger, more egregious things that you could be doing wrong. But most people will kind of figure them out as they go, and we'll touch on that just a bit. For developmental technique, if we're covering the big stuff, the main lifts and the variations, so mechanically similar movements are going to be the close analog variations to like the main lift. So for a bench press, like a close grip bench or a pause bench, all of these variations that are very common in strength programming all have a particular technique associated with them because they're different, right? They're different from the main lift. And that serves a specific purpose. So you want to be aware of where that setup is to get the desired result. So these technical variables, they can change depending on the goal. And that's how you're going to pay attention to this stuff. So if you want a different stimulus to grow a particular muscle group, reinforce a weakness. So think of like increased range of motion with a lift. If you're doing a variation, or even if you're just comparing two lifts to each other, if you're doing one that has more range or has more control, more time under tension, basically more what we would consider kind of a bodybuilding cadence, that's generally associated with better hypertrophy specific stimulus. That doesn't mean always, and of course, it's not a hard fast rule, but just very loosely, we can think of that extra time under tension being great for generating volume. You know, it's kind of two sides of the same coin. If you're lifting longer, more work is being done. So that's kind of like more volume in a sense. So they go very well with each other. Ass to grass squats, stiff leg deadlifts, dead hang pull-ups instead of like the short cheaty ones that you guys love to do. Anything with any amount of tempo, control, stability is going to kind of bleed into that volume dynamic we generally associate with muscle building. Decreasing the range of motion is going to mechanically advantage you. It's going to allow you to lift more weight because not as much work has to be done per repetition. So, I mean, you can go broke on these. You can really pile up the weight. You're talking about pin presses, rack pulls, bands are great. Things like the slingshot, because you get to build up momentum and then practice speed moving into that overload at the top. So even there, your potential for overload at the top is greater because you're using bar momentum to get that heavy lockout. And it's great for overload. It's a strength specific adaptation. Yes, you can work weaknesses at that specific point that you start from, but as you get better at it, you're going to notice that the increase in load you can use has a huge strength carryover. So that's one of the reasons that you'll have like Circamax stuff going into some powerlifting preps. If you follow Westside at all, they load you up the couple of weeks before the meet because they want that strength specific stimulus to get your nervous system woken up. And then if you disadvantage yourself, that's basically making a joint's job harder. So depending on where the joint is relative to the load, remember horizontally, this is how leverage works. Joints over here, the further away the load is horizontally, the more work this joint has to do. So you can think of like close grip bench. Like obviously now the load's right here in your hand, your elbow is getting further away horizontally. Where in a regular bench, it's directly stacked. Elbow has to work harder. That means a tricep is working harder. Sorry, ignore my meaty triceps. I know they get in the way of the camera lens. Anything where the joint itself goes through more range of motion than it otherwise would have. You can think of like a wide grip bench is the opposite, hand out here. So now the pectoral has to do a lot. It's almost like a fly. Like the further out your hand is, the pectoral has to do a lot more work. So by changing these things with the lift, you can really improve or decrease how much stimulus a particular body part is getting. And when you're trying to put together a program that focuses on either keeping you well-rounded or targeting weaknesses, which you will get eventually, you need to be able to think about this critically. And that also goes into like exercise discovery. Like when you're trying to go through the thought process of figuring out, okay, what should I do? Where am I weak? What's lagging? Or what's not included in my program? If you start to think in terms of the movements and how changing these little setups can dramatically impact where the stress is and which muscles are being engaged, that can help you a ton when it comes to decision making with your competitive setup. The way you go through this process of getting a handle on your best possible competitive lift, it's not very straightforward, and we'll go over kind of how to start. But over time, the more variation you get with these movements, the better a sense you're going to have of how you feel when you make these different changes and what to expect depending on, you know, screwing around with your feet, screwing around with your knees, your elbows, and so on. So this all ties in together. Now, the big developmental part, and you guys know this is big with me because I'm accusing all of you of slacking on your accessory exercises. I was just talking to an old vet the other day, and he said the exact same thing. It's like, you idiots that come in and start doing squat, bench, dead, and nothing else, go hang out in the dumbbell section for a while, give it 6 months, watch yourself get rounded out, your conditioning, coordination improve, get some muscle on you, then come back and see how dramatically better you are. Even if you are a vet, even if you are an intermediate or above and you've been doing this stuff for a while, you need the accessory. It's easy volume. It's easy stimulation. It doesn't require deloads. It doesn't take your soul to like add up the volumes. Just a little bit more time. It's homework. So when we're considering technique here, now we're thinking, how can we milk these for all they're worth? So we're not just blindly going through the dumbbell presses like, oh, I wish I was benching right now. You have to focus on what you're doing. You know how you change hands, grip position, elbow position. All these things will affect it in a different way. So the big controversy here with the smaller stuff, and I'm sure many of you have watched the channels that engage in this discussion, some camps really focus on strictness. Some camps really, like you Mike Israel guys, like he loves him some strictness. If it's controlled, if it's full range of motion, if there's a strict tempo, like it's the best thing ever. And granted, there's a benefit to do this and learning how to lift like this. Control quality of the movement is big with these guys. Strictness isn't always, however, associated with the best performers. So as far as like a con, like why this might not be the best way to go at all times for everybody. We can think of the biggest bodybuilders. You know, you watch Branch Warren back in the day, Ronnie Coleman back in the day, Dorian Yates back in the day, some of the biggest guys, some of the best powerlifters or strongmen back in the day. You think of the muscle monsters. A lot of them used a lot of body English. In fact, I was listening to Justin Harris when he was on the Elite FTS podcast with Dave Tate, and he was talking about technique, in his opinion, seems to be the way Ronnie used to lift, which is limited range of motion, explosive, and just controlling the eccentric just enough to kind of mitigate the potential of injury. So not getting completely reckless. And there are a ton of bodybuilders that lift like that. And it makes sense. You're elevating intensity, neurological stimulation. You're still getting fatigued. The muscle still gets fatigued either way. And the range of motion kind of, there's this sweet spot where, you know, blood can't really get in or get out. So you reach that fatigue a little bit faster. There's a lot of things that make that work. So that might work against the people in the strictness camp. Range and time under tension can really be limited when you're being very strict. It can limit load when you're being very strict. Range and time under tension, it mandates that less weight be lifted. So if you want to increase load, and if that's something that you want to use as a driving developmental force, then it makes sense to sacrifice a little bit. It's not that one's better than the other. There's a very real trade-off here. And then the overall number of training variables are going to be limited. You have less tools in the box. Like, wouldn't it be cool if sometimes you can be strict and sometimes you can use a little bit of slop? Even as far as newer lifters are concerned, isn't it good to like learn how you should train that way? So it's not just some reckless spastic shit show where you look like you're having a seizure as you try to do lat pull downs. Now, others are in this bodybuilding camp we just talked about. I just mentioned Justin Harris, Ronnie Coleman. Others prioritize technique that involve highest effort and shoot for blind fatigue. Like, work hard at all costs, whether I feel it in the muscle group or not. Like, I'm just going to move weights until I can't move weights. Now, the cons to this brand of training, as effective as it might be in certain situations, performers that use these tactics, they might be the survivors when you think of survivorship bias. So it's like the people that make it back. And in the case of sports, those are the best performers. Those are the world record holders. You don't see the people that didn't make it, the people that maybe dropped out, or maybe this didn't work, or maybe it caused problems and they had to take some other route, or they got injured or whatever. Maybe these few people that made it are the only ones that could have made it. And you never know. It's a possibility. So it's why you have to think of it that way. We don't just look at the best in the world and say, oh, well, he did it, so of course I should do it. It can also influence new lifters who don't have a base, so who haven't like earned this type of lifting. That's a very real thing, because you need some kinesthetic ability. If you're cheating into a movement, if you're swinging, or if you're using these explosive partial reps, if you're just kind of heaving, you still need to have a deliberate awareness of which muscles the stress should be on, of how you're moving. There still has to be that connection. And when you're completely untrained, you don't have that connection. And it could very well be that you're kind of bypassing those pathways. So where an advanced lifter might be getting a very real stimulus out of this type of movement, somebody who's not very strong or their strength is very lopsided, you get people with their legs are just way, way stronger than their upper body or something. And these imbalances make it so that you're not exactly doing the same thing just by virtue of you not being experienced and have that base. So it is better to learn control, to learn coordination, learn how to separate your limbs and train them independently of the rest of your body. There's value to that, but there's also value with athletic stuff. So I say there's room for both, but I would warn that newer lifters should be a little bit more cautious here. So which is better? It's likely situational. It depends on their kinesthetic abilities. Like how good are they with movement? How is their athleticism? What's the most recent thing they've been doing in their training? What's their experience like? Are they just spastic fucking idiots that just want to get in and move around for the sake of it? Or do they have a goal, and are they receptive to how their training is getting them closer to that goal? So important questions to ask. No right answer, just principles to think about, to apply to yourself, to try to make better decisions as they come up in real time. Performance technique. Now, this is what most of us are considering when we're thinking about technique. This is probably what you clicked on this for. How to lift the most weight. What is the best technique? Should you arch on your bench? Should you not? Should you go sumo and label yourself and your family for generations to come as filthy cheaters? I'm about to answer that right now. These techniques that we use, and let's specifically say competitively. Let's talk about competitive sports here. Even if you're not a competitor, just think of yourself that way. If you're just trying to contort yourself to lift the most weight as possible. These techniques increase the ability to move weight for the sake of it, so it's completely performance driven. We do it by increasing efficiency and by reducing range of motion. Those are the big ones. Efficiency is really just optimizing your setup around your body type. And this is why I can't just point to one particular technique. There's principles, but there isn't one particular technique for everybody because everybody's built differently. I don't care how many times you watch starting strength. Like, okay, it's a great, easy way to squat. But as soon as you get strong, you're going to start taking inventory of your own particular build, your own set of strengths and weaknesses. And you're going to start to think of better ways of doing the same thing. And eventually, you'll adapt out of it. That's just part of it. Some of you might be very comfortable that way, using the hip drive, just slamming your butt straight up like a stripper, bending over to pick up a dollar bill. And if you are, great. But that's a process of discovery. So like optimizing leverages, I always talk about my hobbit limbs. This is why I like this Mike Israel setup, because I get to watch him and think about like my arms. It's like the same perspective because he has stubby arms like me. He's just a lot more jacked right now. I have these short arms, so it's a short lever. The weight never gets that far away from the main joint that's working. And for me, I can get away with a lot more in, say, a squat. So optimizing my leverages aren't so important, or optimizing my leverage isn't so important, because depending on where I put my feet or put my knees, there isn't this dramatic change in what the musculature has to do to accommodate. Now, if somebody were to have very long legs, then how they set up in a squat, every inch they move their feet or everything they do with their knees or hips is going to dramatically change their leverages. And it's going to feel more like walking a tightrope. So that for them, it's very important to understand how you're built and to be able to set your leverages up around that. And I've put out plenty of content, blog posts. I've written about it in my book, Superior Deadlift. I went way, way deep into deadlift leverages. I think I have a video up on it as well. And I'm sure I will talk about it well into the future. But that's a consideration when you're talking about your performance technique. You want to limit wasted movement when you're trying to increase efficiency. And that can be tricky. Again, these aren't hard, fast rules. So think of pressing a bench press. The barbell goes straight up. Are you pressing in a straight line, or are you arcing over your face? There's arguments for both. And there have certainly been world-class lifters who have done both. Straight line is more efficient because it's limited the wasted movement. There's no wasted movement, straight up, straight down. On the other hand, that's not where you're mechanically the strongest at every piece of the lift. So there's a trade-off there. If you arc back over your face, every inch that bar gets back over your eyeballs, you're moving that bar closer and closer and closer to stacked over your shoulders. And remember, it's a horizontal distance. So the lower the bar is down your chest, the more distance there is between your shoulder joint and the bar. That's where its leverage is, right? So as you scoot back, every inch you get that bar up, it gets stronger. And that's really how you grind a lift. So there's trade-offs. So it's not completely universal. It's not black and white here. There's different ways to limit wasted movement, and that might have different implications. The big lifts, squatting, deadlifting, you're not going to be moving the bar on a 600-pound deadlift around your goddamn kneecaps. You're not. So with those, yes, straight line. Your body's going to have to do some moving around the barbells. Preventing strength leak. Oh my God. So many people. This is why the rounded back thing drives me crazy. Like, whatever you feel about the data regarding injury rates and posture, whatever, I don't even care about that nearly as much as I care about what a shitty way it is to pull. Because if your back gives as you're pulling, that is wasted effort. That's leaking strength. The muscles of your legs and hips are putting out all of this force to try to move this weight, and the bar's not going anywhere because your spongy ass spine has to give first before you can actually get purchase on the bar and start moving it against gravity. It's a waste of effort. It's the worst way to, even if you get very strong, and it's possible, some people have gotten strong that way, it still says that you're not willing to make small tweaks to get as much out of your lift as you possibly can. And that is a small tweak. If you're going to start with a rounded back, start that way. But if you get spongy, same thing with benching. If you get spongy when you bench, if your shoulders are moving around, if you push up and your body goes back, that is strength leak. That is a worse way to move weight. Reducing range of motion, that's, everybody understands that. I mean, that's the same reason that we do partial movements for overload. Mechanically, you're stronger, less work has to be done. Sumo shortens the range of motion. Arching shortens the range of motion. Going really wide with your stance or your grip, it all does that. And that's essentially how we try to put up the best lift on the platform. Now, if you consider, let's say, Olympic lifting or some strongman stuff, shortening the range of motion isn't an option, so we focus on efficiency at every step of the lift. Now, the effectiveness is going to depend hugely on personal factors. Arching isn't going to be viable for you if you have a stumpy little torso. If you're built like a thumb, you're not going to get much out of your arch. Your shoulders might be more stable, but you're not going to reduce that range of motion. Where your knees are going in a squat, well, that depends on how your hips are shaped. It depends on how long your femurs are. All these things come into play. So build is a big one. Muscular strengths and weaknesses, that's another one. You get good at how you train. I mean, that's the fact. So there are plenty of examples of people with suboptimal, what you would say mechanically non-optimal setups, where any trained coach would look and be like, well, you're giving up pounds here, here, and here. But the thing is, if you're not used to moving that way, if all of the thousands of reps you've done to wire your nervous system to move a certain way aren't oriented towards that setup, you're not going to be dialed in over there. It's going to be in this other setup you're used to where you're comfortable, and you've seen all of this massive amount of adaptation to get you comfortable in that spot. This sumo is a great example. Everybody says, well, if sumo's so easy, why don't you do it? It's because if you don't train it, you're not going to be good at it. And nobody's making the argument when you talk about these things that, well, you should be able to just go, switch, transition over and immediately pull more. Skill is still relevant. Now there's this thing, I see this a lot, the illusion of technique. Oh my God. And this is, if you're new, I feel bad for you, because especially in the age of YouTube and the internet, this is very hard to parse out, because there's a lot of people that look like they're super techniquey. They're super just dialed in. It's like, oh my God, it's so beautiful. But these exaggerated cues can often be distractions. They can be counterproductive to how the lifter's built, or to preserving energy or being efficient in the movement. And this is extremely common. So don't think just because somebody has some elaborate setup that they're not just actually peacocking, because that's often what it is. The perfect example is everybody's ridiculous setup before they deadlift. Peacocking. Go watch somebody before a 500-pound clean and jerk and see what they do. They don't do the stupid shit, scooping twisting your feet into the ground, shaking your hips, looking up, raising your arms, taking a breath, huffing and puffing, bringing your arms down. All of that garbage it's a distraction. Now, you might do very well doing that, but it's not because you do all that stuff. It's like, I can have Tourette's and still be a good lifter. The Tourette's is not why I'm a good lifter. So I actually had a really good example of this. my boy Cameron Hansen, who is turning into a really good strongman. He'd been training at my gym since he was 16. I think he's 22 now. And already a grown man, getting his own place with his girlfriend. So proud of him. But he's a perfect example. He never moved super clean. There was always something a little wonky with some of his lifts. He was kind of fluid and athletic in some ways. In other ways, he really wasn't. And we had to do a lot of work to kind of solidify a really consistent technical setup with him. Well, one of the things he did on a clean? He would do a power clean, and he had this very exaggerated, almost like a rattlesnake, like unfurling out of a wicker basket in some Indian stereotype cartoon. But he would do it very explosively and really exaggerate his wrists and elbows, and he would end up in this rack position. And the start would look pretty good, and the finish would look pretty good, but nothing that went on from point A to point B was efficient. And I remember he made a comment that his like track coach was like, "Oh, it's picture perfect technique." And I'm like, I hate to break it to you, but your track coach is a fucking idiot. Like, he didn't pop up on his heels. There was no triple extension. It was like the hips scooped in this weird way. It was basically like a reverse curl. He didn't dip back under the bar at all. It was anyways, it was a mess. And we worked on it. It's better now, I think. It's better. But that's a perfect example. You can look at somebody and think that their technique is flawless. Aside from the fact that it just may not work to you, your build, your strengths, it may be garbage technique anyways. So ask around, talk to people, get a consensus before you look at somebody lift and think that's it. So a basic checklist, and this is for the competitive stuff. This is for trying to optimize performance. So the first thing you should concern yourself with when you're going through your technique, don't fidget with the bar placement. Don't fidget with your feet. Don't fidget with your hips or your elbows or whatever. Don't do a bunch of weird breaths. First thing you want to do is think conceptually, where is the handle of this lift? The handle is what I refer to when I'm talking about the point of purchase. It's where you're at the bottom of the lift, the most disadvantaged part. And it can either be really awkward or it can be real compact, real efficient, real clean. So think about the bottom of a squat. When I'm at the bottom of the squat, I can feel my glutes and quads. I can feel my positioning. I can feel the compression. I know where my power is at the bottom of a squat. If squatting is awkward for you, you need to get into the position, and it might not be obvious at first, but you need to get into the position where you're like, oh, this is it. This is where I move weight. And it's going to be relative. It's like, oh, I do this with my knees. It feels like shit. I'm spread open. I don't have any power. Oh, I do this. There it is. I feel like I have something to grab onto. That's the handle. So think about where the handle is. Think about where you have the most advantage at the bottom of the lift. The bottom of the bench, you want to feel tight. You want to feel compressed. You want to feel in control. That's why so many people fidget with their lats. For whatever reason, they have this handle at the bottom. If they flare their lats or squeeze against their lats, they can just move all this weight off their chest. That's great if that's what works for you. But your setup needs to take into account where you're strong and where you are comfortable at the bottom. That's generally going to be where you're going to develop the best. You want to smooth out the stroke. That is a big one. No, this is not adult film set terminology. We're talking about making the movement and the transitions that happen during the movement as clean as possible. So if you're watching somebody lift and there's a lot of shit going on, it's one of the reasons I don't like the starting strength squat that much. Is a big hip drive effective to get the bar going? Sure. But it's easy. Not everybody does this. I'm not saying everybody does, but it's easy to get in the habit of shoving your hips up before everything else. So to have this big push with the legs and transition into having to get upright and get your hips through, that's like two separate movements. The stroke is going to be most efficient when everything kind of happens at once. That's not always going to be possible, again, depending on your build, how extreme it is. But that's something you want to look for. How do you smooth out this stroke? Also, more efficient movement patterns, as in things that snap to lockout from point A to point B, they're easier to train and they adapt to load much, much more easily. It's when you get these transition points, you have this no man's land that you're like hanging out in and it feels horrible. That's where you end up with this poverty lift. You can't figure out how to make it through. It's like even when you're fast off your chest, you still have this dead spot in the middle of your bench press. The same thing with your deadlift. If you have this dead spot around your kneecaps, but the guys that can just snap in a lockout, they will notice that adaptation to the movement, to the load is much more straightforward. Yeah, increasing mechanical leverages. That's kind of it, right? Every inch you move, you should be inching your way up into a stronger and stronger and stronger position. You can also consider speed when you're considering your setup. Are you going to be a reactive, dynamic, explosive lifter, or are you going to be very slow and deliberate, like a forklift? So I think about Tigger versus Tow Mater. Are you going to be bouncy and springy, or are you going to be slow and rusted out and, like a wench on a rusty pickup truck? This is going to have huge implications for how you lift and where your best point of purchase is. Very slow lifters tend to be wider stance, hip dominant squatters. You're going to see a lot more low bar guys coming down under control and evenly reversing their squat. High bar, you have more capacity to bounce. Doesn't mean you have to do one or the other, but it's relevant. Similarly, you can watch some of the bench setups of some of the greats. You'll see guys, the Daniel Zamani, when he hit this questionable 804 bench press, which I almost hope is real because I feel like that would blow the internet up more. I'm just here for the drama, guys. You see how fast he drops it. I mean, he does a pretty fast drop and hold at the bottom. Jeremy Hornstra does something similar. A lot of lifters will drop it quick because they're trying to utilize that stretch reflex, and they're typically very explosive. Slower lifters might be a little bit more deliberate on their setup, come down under control, hit that sweet spot in reverse direction evenly. So again, where do you think your strength is? Creating stiffness, that's what you have to consider. Use antagonists and supportive muscles to increase support and prevent strength leak. So we talked about it with the deadlift, stiffness in the midsection. I don't even care about posture nearly as much as I care about you just not moving during the lift. And part of the way that you do that is you learn how to be stiff through your torso. Same thing with your bench press. Bicep and lat tightness during the lift makes you more rigid. There's more compression. So think about that during your setup. That's also part of finding your handle. So consider that. And then you want to include periods of variety for discovery. This is huge because people always talk about what to do right now to find your setup. It is a process. You will find different things that you like, and you're not going to find them if you're not experimenting. Now, most people, when they experiment on their own, they're just doing shiny object syndrome. Like every time they're on IG, let me try this stance. Let me try that stance. I mean, I've had lifters that have been doing it for less than a year, and we have their perfect setup. Like, this is where you look good. This is where you're going to compete. This is where you're most efficient. And 2 days before a meet, they're going up and trying the sumo setup of their favorite lifter. Like, well, let me just see how this feels. Or they're switching their grip. Like Leroy Walker benches with a close grip. Let me try to do that. That might be good for me just because I just saw that 5 minutes ago. So that's not a good way to experiment. The best way is to include regular variations, like I said earlier, that change your leverages, change where your advantage is, and give you a sense of how to move. And every time you get comfortable in one of those exercises, and every time you start to develop, you will have an increased sense and increased ability to move effectively no matter what your setup is. And it will give you just more insight into where you should be and what you should be focusing on while you're lifting. And that'll help you make decisions if you want to try this new technique. And there's a lot of examples for that, depending on what variation you did, you might go back to the drawing board and be like, well, I notice I actually get a bit more speed off the bottom when I do this variation or whatever. And you can incorporate that over time as it makes sense. And again, always to solve a problem, guys, always to solve a problem. So that's really important, variety. And it's one of the reasons why I'm a bigger fan of newer lifters doing more exercises than just doing a couple barbell lifts. Now, injury prevention. I'm not going to do a deep dive here. I'm in the process of putting something together that does justice to the topic. But for now, just know that there is a bit of controversy. If we're talking about technique impacting injury rates, intuitively, a lot of people that have been around will say it's relevant, it's a factor. And there's this narrative now that says that it's not really, and it has to do with these other factors. Just know that it's not cut and dry. There's conflicting opinions from experts, and the spectrum ranges of focusing on millimeters of hip shift to just saying, nah, it'll be fine, and calling it good. That wasn't a very good critical drinker voice. I'm sorry. Conclusions on either side, look, they're based on limited data. That's the fact. Anybody who's trying to represent the field as it exists, whether it's medicine or training or physical therapy, whatever it is, there is limited data, and it's being interpreted by human beings who are also flawed and limited and have biases and so on. Some of the biases are in their area of expertise. Some of the biases are in, whatever benefit they get of representing themselves as an expert or committing to the data as it exists now. Bottom line is, if I want to see data where I can say inconclusively that this is the case and this is how we should proceed forward, I want to see like a Soviet encampment of elite lifters with nano robots roaming through their bloodstream, calculating every data point, every cell division, every nervous impulse since the time they were 5 years old. That's what I want to see. Now, we're never going to get to that spot, but as long as you have human variability, you really have to concern yourself with how dead on the data we have is. So it's getting better, and the discussion's important. It's helpful. So all I'm going to say is there's controversy. Now, the thing is that humans do adapt. Like I said, you get good at how you train. That really is one of the points to consider when you're considering your best competitive setup. Even if it's not optimal, you still adapt. And we adapt right up until we don't. So the stress that grows you can be the same stress that causes something catastrophic. There's a matter of how likely is it? Well, that probably depends on how egregious you're being. And most people aren't that egregious. So that is something to consider. Some do get strong using a technique that might just completely destroy other people. I see a lot of people that deadlift in a way that I know from experience through 10 years of injury, I can't get away with. My body never adapted the way I needed it to, so I had to go through the back door. Again, that's not porn set terminology here. Got to be careful with my euphemisms. You want to worry less, in my opinion, about smaller one-off injuries because those are going to happen to some extent. And when they do happen, they're likely not directly responsible or directly impacted by exactly what your setup was. I'm more worried about chronic issues, moving a certain way, playing into a specific joint in a certain way that leads to, tension or tightness that affects your ability to do normal movement. So something has to compensate, or, maybe you're prone to knee issues or whatever. And maybe your squat setup was playing into that. All you have to know is that everybody's different. Everybody's going to adapt at a different pace. And if the pace of recovery is outpaced by the stress, again, that all depends on you and your specific issues. That's where we get these overuse issues. And your technique can play into that. If you have knee tendinopathy, you're not going to do a bunch of high bar squats. It's going to make it worse. It's going to play into it, right? So typically guys go wider stance, push their knees back. So this is something you want to take into account in real time as you roll through, as you see how your body responds. These are just things to keep in your mind. I actually think there's a genetic component to durability that nobody ever talks about, which is why you can have some people more so than just like fast twitch ability or muscle fiber composition or whatever. I really do think there is a genetic component to how durable you are and how well you recover in the face of frequent teardown. The most technique-y sport you can think of is Olympic lifting. You're talking about drilling perfect technique, perfect efficiency, and doing the same thing in, day out for multiple times a day, 6 days a week for years on end. You would think that, okay, if you are going to get a better result by keeping your technique tight, these would be the guys that just don't get injured. Now, their injury rates, I think, are pretty good compared to other sports, but shit still happens. And more often than that, remember survivorship bias, people still get chewed up. The people you see at the top outlived some other elite lifters that either couldn't progress fast enough or fell by the wayside. And that group outpaced the intermediate lifters that couldn't hang and fell by the wayside. And more aggressive programs have done that quicker. The Bulgarian system is notorious for chewing lifters up. So it's very different when you're looking at a pool of disposable lifters and saying, what is going to get us 3 or 4 guys to the podium at the expense of everybody else versus, hey, you, what works for you? What is going to keep you walking that tightrope of recovery and stress? So it's just something to consider. Technique checklist for injury prevention. Don't be an idiot. I mean, Mike Israel put out a video very much like this. That's the first thing he said, like, don't be stupid, which is actually very underrated advice. Don't make ego-driven decisions. I think people suffer the most. I know I've suffered the most when I got ballsy and went for something big that I had no business doing. Don't expect that at any point in your training, you should be able to go to 100% and pull off a PR, 100% plus 5. Don't expect that. If you're in a phase where you haven't been in that range for a long time and your warm-up weight's flying and you're like, fuck it, I'm going to go from 315 to 525 and just see what happens. That's how you put your neck on the railroad tracks. Like, don't do that. So my short checklist, just broad principle-based stuff to think about as you go. Be aware of what your actual technique is and move deliberately. That's one. Don't just move because this is how I move. Understand where your positioning is. Understand what it does to aid the lift. Be aware of it. If you're not aware of what you're doing, you can't be aware of how to reinforce it or how to make up for deficiencies or how to keep yourself well-rounded. Thing two, aim for consistency. That's the other thing. Reproducibility. The variation should come from deliberate variations. Again, they should all have their own very specific setup that you're aware of, but don't sign off on this variability from different percentages. I personally think if 90% moves differently than 75%, you have a big problem and you don't have business getting to 100% until it's fixed. And that's mirrored by some of the best lifters and coaches in the world. And it's mirrored by literally every other sport in the world where foundational technique determines how you are going to move at the highest possible level. So don't be lazy. Don't give yourself passes. And anyways, efficiency. That's going to lead to more efficiency. So the injury argument doesn't even matter. Pay attention to individual differences. Again, that's part of being aware because your features will greatly change the stress you experience, and know that what worked for somebody else may not work for you. And that's in terms of the best technique. That's in terms of rehabilitative protocols. Just because somebody experienced something like, hey, I rolled out my IT band and it felt great. It's like, well, my IT band hurt. I rolled it out and it felt like shit. And then I had a PT tell me not to do that. So just know that you have to take everything with a grain of salt. Pay attention to yourself and don't neglect basic body maintenance. This is a big one. I really believe a lot of lifters deal with unnecessary bullshit because they let themselves get turned into these little like muscle Kirby's, like Kirby from the video games, like Smash Brothers. Just these little knots that only exist to move through this very deliberate plane. The stretching argument makes me mad because nobody's ever been disadvantaged or done themselves disservice by doing too much stretching. Plenty of lifters have ran into a wall where they got tight, they got bound, they had to adjust their movement, not for the better, in order to accommodate their lack of basic mobility. So we're not talking about being contortionists here. You're not trying to be Daljean. Another video game reference for you. You're trying to move well. If Hafthor, who can deadlift 1,100 fucking pounds, if he can lock his kneecaps out when he's strapping up, like he's able at 440 pounds of putting his palms on the ground, you are not going to lose gains because you kept your hips a little mobile. So a little bit of stretching is warranted, especially if it's something that's actively causing you problems. So maintain your body, good movement ability, general conditioning, I think is useful as well. That's going to allow you to last longer, not fatigue so well, limit the potential for getting in a really fucked up position just because you're gassed either in a meet or in a really hard training session. So I think these things go a long way to keeping you in one piece. So in summary, technique matters for predicting the developmental effect. So keeping a sharp eye on how your body moves while you're doing dumbbells and machines and variations, hugely important for that. Not that there is a right or a wrong way, but a lot of experimentation and note keeping is going to be important there. Technique can be tweaked to make movements more efficient and improve performance. And this is what most of you are here for. Again, very individual, and it will be determined by a lot of principles. There isn't one set form. Form isn't right or wrong, good or bad. But as I say that, I'm going to warn you not to be the person who sees somebody doing some stupid shit and by default says, well, form isn't good or bad. It's like, that doesn't mean that bad form doesn't exist. It just means finding it for yourself requires some discovery, and it's not worth just trying to slap a label on it and call it good. And then injury prevention in common problem areas in lifting tends to be the shoulders, knees, and back. It can be aided by deliberate, consistent practice and just having a good head on your shoulders, not making egotistical decisions. Take the health and maintenance of your body seriously. And again, this should be part of general practice anyways. I don't even need to prove to you that you're going to reduce injury risk if you do this, because you're going to improve your actual performance, which is why we're here anyways, right? So put that in your pipe and smoke it. Thank you so much for stopping by, guys. Let me know what you think. Go ahead and check out the Base Strength Forum on Facebook, absolutely free. Support me on Patreon and the YouTube memberships page if you are feeling charitable today. Thank you so much for stopping by, guys. Let me know what you think. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.